So welcome back. Why don't we go ahead and just get started and dive right into programming some AI for our enemy. The next few videos is going to be really code heavy and really intensive. A lot of syntax errors can occur. A lot of things can go wrong if you don't follow exactly. So just follow along with me, pause the video, code with me, constantly test your scene, and hopefully you guys won't find this too terrible. Um, I'm probably overhyping the difficulty. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. So the first step we're going to take with our enemy character right here is we got to figure out how our enemy is going to see our player. We need some kind of indicator to let the enemy know when our player is near so we can start firing off different kinds of states such as walking towards the player. So we're going to start with our first script for our character here. So I'm going to go into my scripts folder, and I'm actually going to make a new folder inside of scripts. I'm going to call this enemy right there. And I'm going to create a new C# script, and we're going to call this enemy site. And capital E, capital S on that, make sure that. All right, so after we get that script made, we're going to drag and drop it onto my Sentinel up there. All right. So now my Sentinel has a enemy site script attached. I want to minimize some of these. All right. So let's go ahead and open up enemy site. I'm going to do that by double clicking on my script right here in my project folder. And let's prepare our script for some hardcore coding. All right. So we got to make sure that our enemy can see where our player is. We've already got that set up a little bit with our sphere collider here. Our sphere collider is our field of view for our Sentinel here. And actually, I'm going to go ahead and expand it a little bit, make it a little bit larger. All right, so now that my field of view is 3 units across, I'm ready to start coding. And why don't we go ahead and start with some variables. All right, so the first variable we're going to make is a Boolean, public bool, and we're going to call it player in sight. No big deal there. We're going to hit Control S to save. And before we keep going on, why don't we go ahead and set our player character, in this case, it's a Gambit. We're going to go ahead and tag him as player. That's going to be pretty important in our site functionality here. All right, so after we do that, why don't we go to our void start. And in fact, I'm going to change this from void start to void awake, just to get even a quicker jump on the code I'm about to do right here. And I'm going to say, it looks like we actually need another variable. Let's do a public game object and call it player, because we need to be able to find where our player is. And what we're going to do to find our player is we're going to go player equals game object dot find game objects, not find game objects with tag, and we're going to find our player here. Hit Control S to save. And now we need to do some on trigger functions here. So let me get rid of this. So I'm going to keep update here for the time being. But I'm going to make some void on trigger statements here, or functions. I'm going to go on void trigger stay. So as long as my player stays within inside my sphere here, we'll be able to execute the following code. And we're going to do a collider other. And then set up my brackets. And I'm going to go ahead and copy and paste this right below it. Void on trigger. And we're going to have a trigger function for whenever our player exits our sphere collider. All right. So what are we going to put in here? Well, we need to have an if statement. If other.gameObject equals our player, then we're going to say player in sight equals true. And I'm just going to copy and paste this code down here as well. But this time I'll change it to false. So when our player enters and stays within my collider, our player in sight boolean will be true because our player will be inside of my Sentinel. And when he exits my collider, player in sight will turn to false. So let's hit Control S, and why don't we test this out real quick. Make sure everything's working really well. I'm going to go bring up my console panel here. And real quick, I'm going to go back to my Gambit controller script here. And just to keep our console a little bit less cluttered, I'm going to comment out these state logs that we have that we made last video here. That way our console window is not being cluttered up with idle state, walk state, attack one state of our Gambit character. So I'm going to select my Sentinel game object in my hierarchy so I can see player in sight and player variables that I just created. That way I'll be able to test. First time playing this scene, so it's packing up some sprites. And now we're inside of our game. As you can see, my Sentinel is still chugging along. And if I walk towards my Sentinel, we can get a view here. In my scene view, I'm outside where I should be. There we go. I'm outside of the sphere, so our player is not in sight. But as I walk in, my player is now in sight of the Sentinel. So that's perfect. Now we have a very simple way to determine if our player is within sight of our enemy here. All right, so why don't we go ahead and write some code to move our enemy towards the player whenever he is in sight. So I'm going to go and create a new script here, and we're going to call this enemy walk. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and drag and drop this on my Sentinel here. And now I have a enemy walk script. So why don't we open up our enemy walk script real quickly. Let's get the formatting just the way we like it, or the way I like it, rather. Get rid of these comments. I know what they do. All right, so let's start with variables like always. We're going to make a nav mesh agent variable, and we're going to call it of type. Well, it's a type nav mesh agent, and we're going to call it nav mesh agent. And I want you guys to take note of the syntax here. Whenever we call a component within our inspector, we start with a capital N, and the lowercase n denotes the actual variable name we'll be using for our nav mesh. And I've actually spelled that wrong here. This variable here will allow us access to our nav mesh component in our inspector here that's attached to our enemy. So I'm going to go ahead and change this void start to void awake. And after I've initialized this variable, I need to declare it real quick. So we'll say nav mesh agent equals get component, and then capital N nav mesh agent. And that line of code allows me access and see what it did. Unity auto formatted that big N. So I need to go back and make sure it's with the right capitalization. So this right here will give me access. This local variable will give me access to my nav mesh agent in the following code. And we have to do one more thing of this in the same vein. We have to say enemy site because we need to get access to our player in sight boolean. So we have to access our enemy site script. So we do that much in the same way as our nav mesh agent. So we'll say enemy site. And again, it's auto formatting for me, so make sure that doesn't happen. And then we'll initialize enemy site here. This auto formatting is getting on my nerves. I'm sure there's a way to fix it. Enemy site equals get component. And then we're going to call the enemy site script I just made, or reference it rather. All right. That looks like everything is good. I have no idea why that's red. It shouldn't be red. We'll hit Control S, and why don't we just go to our, yeah, I knew there was a syntax error somewhere here. Yep, there we go. There was an equal sign there for some reason. All right, so now everything should be gravy. And my compiler's taking a little bit to compile, so just ignore the little pauses here and there. All right, so let's keep on moving with our enemy move script. Now that we have access to our nav mesh agent and we can access our enemy site script, why don't we add some code here that'll allow us to walk to our player whenever he's in view. So we're going to go to update, and we're going to say if enemy site dot player in sight, we're accessing that variable of whenever our player's inside of our enemy, equals true. And why don't we just set up some brackets then what are we going to do here? If our player is in sight, then we need to make sure we need to somehow tell our our enemy to walk towards our player. So it's actually a pretty simple line of code. Um, we just say, let's see, let me check my reference. We just say nav mesh agent. We access this local variable we declared and initialized earlier. Dot set destination, and we're going to give it a vector coordinate for where to go. So we're going to say enemy site dot target dot transform dot position. This is basically going to take us to the position of our target. But why is that red? Well, we haven't declared a target variable in our enemy site. So let's go ahead and do that real quick. So let's say public game object target, like so. And in my void update, let's say target equals player. All right, so now that's not red anymore because I have a target as specified right here in my void update. So let's hit Control S and see what's going on here. We'll hit play. And what should happen is whenever my Gambit character moves within my sphere here, the guy should move towards there. But he's not. Why is that? Well, let's figure that out. I'm just going to go back and make sure I've saved Control S and Control S. All right. So maybe I just didn't save the updated code there. And let's try this out. And oh my gosh. Well, we have movement. Wow, this character's turned into a linebacker. All right, so obviously that was pretty terrible, right? We have our enemy moving, but whatever just happened, happened. Why don't we go ahead and clean this up and make it more functional? All right, so we got to fix our movement here. So why don't we go and open up our walk here, and let's make some variables real quick so we can kind of control our our crazy sentinel here. So I'm going to go and make some public floats. Enemy speed. And why don't we say enemy current speed. The first variable will be what we set as our speed for our character, and the second float here will display the current speed of our enemy here. All right, so after we get these variables made, I'm going to go to my awake, and we're going to go ahead and set my nav mesh speed to my enemy speed. So we're going to call my nav mesh agent dot speed. We're going to set that equal to enemy speed, like so. So now we can control the speed of our enemy character right from the inspector. It was just a really simple line of code. Instead of changing our speed in our nav mesh agent, we'll be actually able to change our speed within our walk script. So we don't have to really touch our nav mesh agent. So we're going to go and assign this a value of 0.5. And the second thing that happened was our Sentinel here just was turning really crazy. We can see we get a rotation. And since we're dealing with 2D characters here, see how he's following our Gambit here? And that's because we have our nav mesh system baked up, but we don't want our object to rotate. So we got a simple line of code to fix that. We're just going to go to nav mesh agent dot rotation dot update rotation, and we're just going to turn that to false. We're not going to update our rotation with our enemy character here. So we're going to press play again. We're going to go into our scene, and there we go. Now we're having our Sentinel kind of follow us around, and we're able to push him right now with our rigid bodies. We'll go back in and fix that. But for all intents and purposes, we have movement fixed. All right, so I think this might be a good place to stop. Before I do go on to the next video, I'm going to point out some issues we're having here. or some things we need to go in and fix. The obvious three being, or the obvious two being, is that our character's not animating whenever he's moving, and he's not flipping direction according to which direction he's moving. Another issue that we're going to solve is the position in which our sentinel stops at is not very reliable at this point. With a beat 'em up, you kind of want your enemies to face your character, either get behind them or directly in front of them and then attack. You don't really want them attacking, and stopping directly above you like that. So in the next video, we're going to start addressing some of those things. Two more videos will fix those three issues I talked about. So stay tuned to them, and we'll get this Sentinel fixed up with his movement.